just to catch you up on some of the things that are going on. This morning, while you were at your different places and we had a worship service going on here, we offered a new members class. There were like 26, 28 in that, and so we're kind of using Sunday morning as a venue to do that. And so if you want to become a member in the future, that's what we'll do. We'll do those periodically. And last year, you remember, if you were around, we did a trunk or treat where we opened up the campus and a bunch of folks from the community, 1,500, 2,000 came in, and we're doing that again. We're not just doing it just to feed people candy. We're doing it just because we want to show, hey, who we are, what we're like, and be intentional about loving people. And so if you want to join us on that evening, or even if you can't, we're asking folks to help us make sure that we got plenty of candy. So out there you see this big box out there. And so over the next few days, if you would just kind of bring in some candy donations. And then if you were here during the course of the week, what you'd see is our staff will go through and pick out the stuff that we want. And that's important. That's important for us to be ministered to. Julie was doing some teaching with some leaders with Community Bible Study, and I was preparing this message. Both of us simultaneously gathered the same illustration. I didn't steal it from her. She didn't steal it from me, but both of us were like, what, you're using that? And it's a quote from, well, it's one of those Mark Twain quotes. You know, Mark Twain just coined things so uniquely. But this is one of them, and we both stumbled across this past week. But he says, when I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years. And that's just great Mark Twain. All of us, though, have probably experienced something like that, where, you know, you only know your parents for who they are now, and you don't know them for what they once were, or maybe who they represented, or maybe what kind of athletes they were. And when I was growing up, my dad had some disabilities. He had Crohn's disease, and so his health was not real good. He was always in and out of the hospital. So that's the way I thought of my dad. And I can remember as like an 18, 19-year-old young man, and my grandfather pulled me aside and said, wait a minute, you don't know about your dad. My dad evidently was a pretty good athlete. In fact, he was a defensive back in football, and in one particular game, he intercepted 5 passes in one game. And all of a sudden, I'm like, I didn't know he even played football. And all of a sudden, you know, your opinion of your dad is kind of like, really? Get out of town? You did that? Well, in the passage we're going to look at, the Corinthians all of a sudden begin to realize, oh my gosh, the Apostle Paul is more than we ever thought he was. Because Paul hated boasting about himself, and he never did. And so they didn't know who he was and what he represented and what he meant to so many believers worldwide. Well, in this particular passage we're going to look at, we've been studying the book of 2 Corinthians. And the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verses 16 through 29 are going to get a picture of, what? You did that? And their opinion of him will grow as a result, as ours will as well. Paul has just exposed the church in Corinth that has been turning into a masquerade party, where people were trying to somehow, some way, be other than themselves. Paul had gone to great lengths to reveal how the church had been taken captive from what God intended. You know, what God intended is for them to experience, 2 Corinthians 11:3, a pure, simple devotion to Jesus Christ. But somehow the church in Corinth had lost their ball in the weeds. And they had wrongly chosen to follow the leadership of some that were what I want to call spiritual wannabes. They were money grabbers. They weren't humble, not self-sacrificing. They weren't concerned for others' well-being. They were only concerned with self. And Paul pulls back the curtain, so to speak, to expose who they were. They were imposters. Now, it's easy to come to church and go, wait a minute, you're studying this book of antiquity. and you're looking at a story of a church that's 2,000 years old. Well, what relevance does that have to us? Well, I think it has a great deal of relevance. Because what you find in the scriptures is that you have principles that are timeless and true, and yet are malleable enough that they impact whatever generation they're taught in. And that's why we can boldly say that this truth is timeless. And yet the Apostle Paul presents it in a very timely way. And we live in a world where at an alarming rate, biblical teachers are straying from their faith. I don't want to give specific examples. I don't necessarily many times drag people's names through the mud, but at an alarming rate, there's a number of what used to be Christian teachers that are leaving the faith. And yet they're still teaching, but what they're teaching is not Christianity. It's more of this tolerance-focused, really kind of empty thought to say, hey, whatever you are, that's okay. God accepts you just the way you are, and he welcomes everybody. And yet there's a problem. You just unleash all rules and no regulations, and sexuality, do whatever you want to, believe whatever you want to. It all leads to the same road, same place. And they're calling it the reconstruction of Christianity. But the problem with it is it doesn't address our sin capacity. It doesn't address the fact that a brother will sock another brother in the gut for no apparent reason. And we know the reason is because they've got this sin nature. And it's like Paul said, I do not do what I want. I do the very thing I do not want. All of us have this magnet that draws us towards sin. And Jesus is the only one that conquers death and provides a way for us to do the same. He's the only one that addresses this disease called sin. And so Paul is exposing these teachers who are developing a following. But the following they're developing it's very costly to those who begin to follow it because he leads them astray. And so Paul in chapter 11 from verses 12 on becomes kind of like a prosecuting attorney. And in doing so, Paul pulls off the masks of these false teachers. He reveals who they are. Who they are deceitful workers. They try to make people think that, oh, light is dark and dark is light. And then he points out who's behind their ideology. And who's behind their ideology is Satan himself. See, the one who pretends to be someone they are not get their lesson plans from Satan himself. And Jesus called Satan the consummate liar. In fact, he's the inventor of the art that we call lying. He's a deceiver. And he accomplishes his work by masquerading himself as someone he is not. We presented this argument last week. Satan has never come to us as Satan. Satan never presents sin to us as sin. Satan tries to make sin appear to us as something that's good for us. And that's deception. We think something that in reality is bad, we think it to be good for us. And so when we are enticed into sin, it's as if we're saying light is dark. I mean, who in their right mind would say light is dark? It's foolish, it's illogical. And the only way any of us would ever choose to sin is because we become deceived. And Satan wants us that way. When someone has given themselves over to a wrong way of thinking, it's very difficult to get them out of it. Do you ever notice that? When someone gives themselves over to some wrong belief system, it's very difficult to get them out of it. I had a professor who once said, we must allow people time to examine something thoroughly because once they make their stand on an issue, well, few people will ever change because it's too difficult for their ego. Did you ever notice you can't logically talk someone out of a wrong belief system? You would think it'd be very easy, and many of us have tried. Maybe you've got relatives, maybe you've got children, maybe you've got adult parents, maybe you've got friends, and you think, man, you're believing this, and this is so wrong. And logically we think, oh, I could just talk them out of it. And it's very difficult to talk someone out of their wrong belief system. It's as if they say, hey, don't remind me of the facts, my mind is already made up. Well, that's why when we come to know Jesus Christ, When you came to know Jesus Christ for the first time, that was a supernatural act on God's part. When you came to know God, it was like you realized Jesus saved me based upon what he did on the cross, and the Spirit of God convicted us, and we opened our eyes and we saw he is who he says he is. He's the Son of God that takes away our sin, and we believed, and somewhere in that equation we repented that everything that we'd given our lives previously to was wrong. And we were willing to say, I'm wrong, and you are who you say you are, God. And in that moment, we were captured by truth. And maybe for the first time when we came to know Jesus Christ, we realized light is light, and dark, well, it's dark. You know, the interesting thing, we would never admit we were wrong apart from God working in our own heart. Our ego, our pride wouldn't let us. And so when we came to know Jesus Christ, that was a supernatural act on our part to go, oh my gosh, I was wrong, and Jesus is who he says he is. And we saw light as light and dark as dark, maybe for the first time. Well, the group of believers in Corinth had drifted and slipped into a deceived state. They had begun to think, well, light is dark, and dark, well, that must be light. And Paul was on a campaign to convince them of the dark place they had allowed themselves to slip. It's not an easy task to talk someone out of their self-imposed ditch. So Paul starts by saying, you know what? Allow me to be a little foolish. I'm reading from 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. In chapter 11, in verses 16 through 18, he starts off, he's basically saying, hey, I'm going to be a little bit foolish. Allow me to read it. He says, again, I say, let no one think me foolish. But if you do, receive me even as foolish, so that also I may boast a little. What I'm saying is, I'm not saying as the Lord would, but is in foolishness, in this confidence of boasting. Since many boast according to the flesh, well, I'm going to boast also. Now remember, I've already told you that Paul hated to brag, he hated to boast. It's as if Paul is saying, I want you to compare me to these false teachers, not by some arbitrary criteria, but by the criteria that they have set up. I'm going to do that which I think is unthinkable. I will defend myself by doing what I detest. I'm going to boast about my accomplishments. And I want you to know, I think it's foolish to boast. You followed these false teachers because they boasted about their worldly accomplishments. Well, two can play this game. But I want you to understand as I'm beginning, I'm not a fool, so don't take me for one. But since you've been taken into your deceptive state, I will play this foolish game of comparison to get you out of your deceived condition. So as I begin to boast, don't lump me with these false teachers. In fact, I've spent a great deal of time trying to distance myself from these false teachers. I've been humble. They haven't been humble. I care about your well-being. They don't care about anybody but themselves. I've made sure that I'm not a burden to you financially, whereas these men take from you while giving you nothing in return. And Paul is forcing himself to stoop to their level for a few minutes in order to gain a hearing and put an end to this Corinthians following bad teaching. He's about, in their eyes, to become smarter than they ever knew him as. And so we pick it up. Before Paul does that, he gives the Corinthians a brief verbal spanking, and he does that in verses 19 through 21. He's going to kind of shock them maybe into thinking a way that they've never thought before. In verse 19, he says, for you, being so wise, you think of yourself as so wise, and yet you tolerate the foolish gladly. For you tolerate it. If anyone enslaves you, anyone devours you, anyone takes advantage of you, anyone exalts himself, anyone hits you in the face, well, you tolerate all that. To my shame, I must say that we have been weak by comparison. But in whatever respect anyone else is bold, I speak in foolishness. I am just as bold as myself. You think that I'm weak? I'm going to give you my credentials. Paul has focused much of his attention up to this point on false teachers. But he leaves them for just a moment and turns to the Corinthians themselves. Paul wants them to see their tolerance has enslaved them. They have foolishly followed style with no regard to substance. In fact, he says, you accepted these fools. I will speak like one of them to ensure that you will accept me. Paul's fed up. And I'm sure that the Corinthians winced as they read Paul's scathing words. They had turned on their father figure, Paul, and followed these tyrants that were leading them away from what was best for them. All of us have done that from time to time. Maybe it was your parents, maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was a coach who had your best interest at stake, and what you did was you thought, well, I know better, and you turned from them and you followed someone or some ideology that was bad for you. All of us have done that. It's the prodigal son story. Where the prodigal son, he's like, Dad, I don't want it the way you want it. Does the Heisman with Dad and goes off on his own, and we know what happened to him. And yet, the father welcomes him back. All of us have been prodigals, where we think we know better than the authority that God has put over us. Well, Paul is cutting into their ego. But it's a necessary incision because it's the only way to get under their skin to the cancer that was malignant. Do you ever notice the incisions that cure initially have a pain that go with them? I think of people who have come in my life who come up to me, who have a relationship with me, who've said stuff like, you know what, love you, but you know you got this blind spot. You know what a blind spot is? You can't see it and other people can. It's some minute character flaw. It's something that you need to be exposed to, and if you're not exposed to it, well, you won't become better. And then there's somebody in your life who comes up next to you and goes, you know what, you got a blind spot. And it's like an incision that goes, lances through your heart, and you hate it because it doesn't feel good, but you realize the long-term gain overcomes that short-term pain. And you realize that, okay, you know what, I want to reject this. I want to say, you know what, you're wrong. And yet, at the same time, wisdom says, you know what, you're right. And it's a good lance. It's good pain because it leads to some long-term benefit. You know, it's a fool that says, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, and walks away from it. And so it's that initial incision, and that's what Paul's trying to do. He's trying to say, you guys, there's a blind spot. You are following people who are leading you down a wrong path, and it's going to be to your destruction. And it's a blind spot, and you can't see it, and initially it hurts, and yet he's hoping that what it'll see is that these people will understand, the Corinthian church will go, oh my gosh, the benefit outweighs the pain. So are you ready? Here's Paul's resume. No believer has ever had a more impressive one. By the way, it's not based upon boasting abstractly. It's about concrete, real experiences. Experiences that give Paul the God-appointed right to speak not only into the Corinthian experience, but also into our experience as well. And that's why we study his New Testament letters. Because God gave him this appointed role of coaching us. So here's Paul's credentials. We start off in verse 22. It's one short little sentence. He asks the question, he says, are they, meaning these false teachers, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they true? I am. Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews. It says in Philippians chapter 3, verse 5. He was a full-blooded Jew. His parents on both sides, Jewish. But he wasn't Jewish only in bloodline, but in language and culture. These false teachers, they were Hellenistic Jews. We know all about them. He knew Hebrew. He knew Aramaic. He was thoroughly educated in Semitic thought. He asked the question, are they Israelite? I am. As such, he had all the rights, privileges, and heritage that go with being an Israelite. He wasn't grafted in. He was in the bloodline. He was natural. He wasn't just adopted. Then he says, are they Abraham's descendants? He says, I am. He was circumcised on the 8th day according to the scriptures. Paul didn't miss one step of being faultless in his pedigree. Saying, you want to play the game? You want to compare me to these false teachers? Let's compare me to these false teachers. I'm a Hebrew, I'm an Israelite, I'm a descendant of Abraham. Now, by the way, if you want to know what Paul really thought of his heritage, if you really want to know what Paul really thought of his pedigree in terms of giving him any sort of superiority, all we have to do is look over at the book of Philippians, where he tells you about what he really thought about his pedigree. What he thought about his pedigree was it was rubbish compared to knowing Jesus Christ, which literally meant all of these credentials I've got, if you really want to know what Paul thought about them, he says they're excrement compared to knowing Jesus Christ. Because at Paul's core, we know the only thing that gave him any sort of significance, the only thing that gave him a role in the world to speak was the fact that Jesus died on the cross and paid the penalty for his sins, and that he knew Jesus. It wasn't because of any of his superiority, it was because of Jesus. But he's as if he's saying, okay, so I'll play your foolish game, but if you really want to know what he thought, you just listen to his words in Philippians. So Paul plays this foolish game. He stiffens his qualifications. Paul belongs to Jesus. Verse 23, he says, are they, these false teachers, are they servants of Christ? You're following him for that reason. You're following them for that reason. Are they servants of Christ? Then he says, I speak as if insane. I'm more so. In far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. He's saying, are they servants of Jesus? He says, I am, and even more. And then it's as if Paul says, I must be out of my mind to talk to you like this, to lower myself to this level. I hate boasting. But Paul has already established that he doesn't even believe that these false teachers are believers. So it's not hard to compare my devotion to Christ to theirs. They have none. And now Paul, in verses 24 through 29, will painstakingly show he's worked harder and has more proof of his authority than these false teachers, who've really only demonstrated minimal effort, minimal concern for anyone's well-being, other than working for their own selfish wants. Now, let me stop right here a second. If you and I were to sit down and say, hey, knowing what we know about history and the Apostle Paul, how would we write his resume? Probably if we were writing his resume, we would write about the churches he established. There's many. We would write about the number of times he preached. He had countless numbers of appointments where he preached. How many miles he traveled, how many books he wrote, how much money he raised, how many visions God gave him. We'd write about the spectacular miracles he performed. But instead of talking about his exploits, his accomplishments, Paul fills his resume in a way that none of us would ever fill our resume. He fills his resume with the details of his suffering, his loss, his shame, his defeats. Maybe some of you have filled out a resume before and you used it to apply at some sort of job you have. Maybe you've got that current job and you wrote a resume. If you went by the guidelines of Paul in writing your resume, you never would have been hired. But what we're going to see is the way that Paul constructed his resume, not based upon his achievements, but based upon his humiliations. He is the most credible source to coach us in our relationship with Jesus Christ. 6 verses. I want to read them to you from the New American Standard Version, starting in verse 24. This is his resume. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Then he says in verse 28, apart from such external things, there's a daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? You know, if you want to follow Jesus, hear me out. If you want to follow Jesus, the suffering servant, who became less so that we could be someone, then who better to have it as our earthly coach than a suffering servant himself? That willingly became less so that we could see more of what Jesus is like. What a mark of a disciple. That you are willing to become less so that others could see what Jesus is really like. Remember in verse 23, it says that, well, he had imprisonments without number. And then in verse 24, he starts going through this litany of all the things he experienced. If prison was shameful, a flogging was shameful and excruciatingly painful. Jewish scholar Maimonides argued that 39 lashes, well, that's multiples of 3. A scourge, back in the time where Paul was being whipped, wasn't the cat o' nine tails that Jesus was whipped with. It probably would have been a handle with 3 thongs. The middle thong was the hide of a cow. The 2 external thongs were hides of an ass. They would whip a person 13 times. Each time, each blow would leave 3 stripes. 13 blows, 39 lashes. Paul received 5 times that during the course of his ministry, probably draped over a time, not back to back to back, probably over a time of 10, 15 years, he was beaten like that. Paul Meyer of Minworth and Meyer said that Paul had to be very physically tough and emotionally resilient, for an ordinary man would have not have lived through all 5 of those. And most people, after once, would go, I'm keeping my mouth shut. I'm not talking about Jesus. But you couldn't shut him up because he wanted people to know his Savior. Jesus, of course, was whipped with the cat o' nine tails, 39 lashes with 9 stripes. That means it would have left 351 stripes at least. 3 times Paul was beaten with rods. That was a Roman beating. Beating with rods, they didn't attach a number to it. The beatings were not regulated by number. They were done in public. The shame matched only by the agony they inflicted. The whipping, the lashes were of Jewish origin. These beaten with rods, that was more of a Roman origin. All so that people could see what Jesus is like, so that the gospel could be communicated. Once he was stoned, probably recorded in Acts chapter 14, verse 19. We know he was stoned in Lystra. A stoning, that's mob violence. It's only stopped when the victim is presumed dead. All so the gospel could spread. 3 times he was shipwrecked. Can you imagine? I mean, if you went through a shipwreck, that's a traumatic experience. You lived through a plane crash. That would be a dramatic experience. It says 3 times his ship was tossed and was beginning to sink, and so he's abandoned. You know what's interesting? Acts 27 gives an account of another shipwreck he experienced. Well, Acts 27 was written after 2 Corinthians, so he wasn't just shipwrecked 3 times. We know that he was shipwrecked 4 times. On one of those, he spent a night in the open sea, clinging to wreckage. Constantly, he was on the move. Danger from rivers, dangers from bandits, dangers of his own countrymen. It's hard to talk people out of their deception. Danger from Gentiles, all so that the gospel could be spread. He explains he was in danger in every geographical location. You've been in danger? I've been in danger in every geographical location. City, country, water, been there, done that. Also, the gospel could spread. See, the question needs to be asked, why did God allow the Apostle Paul to go through arguably more torment, more tribulation than any believer that we know of in terms of expanse of the magnitude of what he went through? See, I believe that Paul endured every possible difficult circumstance so that he, more powerfully than anyone past or present, can give testimony to the exclusive sufficiency of Jesus Christ. Please follow me on this. It was Paul that said, I am not sufficient of myself, claiming anything is coming from me, for my sufficiency comes from Jesus. It was Paul who would later quote Jesus that would say that Jesus' grace is sufficient for me. His power is perfected in my weakness. Paul never knew luxury. Paul never knew comfort. Paul never knew ease. He never knew rest. Paul didn't have vacations. He commonly knew hunger and thirst, all to prove the exclusive sufficiency of Jesus Christ. Please understand, that's huge. Because if Paul is going to be our coach in how to be a disciple, and he is saying that Jesus is his sufficiency, if Jesus was his sufficiency in all of this torment, then Jesus is sufficient in our issues. See, none of us have gone through what Paul went through. I would doubt that anybody in here has gone through the lashes and the rods and the 4 shipwrecks and the left for dead and the stoning, and none of us have gone through that. Have we gone through some stuff? Sure. But think about the magnitude of this. If Paul is sufficient, if Jesus is sufficient for Paul in all of his turmoil, and he's saying, he's my sufficiency. If Jesus is sufficient for Paul, then you think Jesus is sufficient for you. And I don't say that lightly. I know what some of you have been through. You've been through loss. Some of you, it's the whole job thing, which has been miserable. Some of you have been persecuted by maybe coworkers. Some of you have gone through great physical loss. Some of you have seen spouse maybe die, parents. Some of you have experienced cancer. I don't minimize it. But if Jesus is sufficient for Paul, Jesus is sufficient for you in whatever you're experiencing and more. Never is Christ's influential power more perfected than a willing, suffering servant. Think back with me what he said in verse 28. He said, apart from these circumstances, and then he says, in all the others that I didn't even mention, you mean there was more? He lists all these things he's been through, and he says, and I didn't even mention to you all of them. You mean there's more than that? He said, in all of those, my concern is for the church. And Paul, the pastor, reveals his colors. See, these rival teachers compromise themselves by seeking money, power, and fame. Paul seeks none of that. He is passionately concerned for your righteousness. And Paul was concerned for the believer, corporate and individual, to love Jesus first and foremost. And then that we would have a love for one another, and that love for one another would be a unifying love that would cut through. It would overcome all our preferences and form. You know what? I think God is always testing the body of believers. Will we scrap our preferences for the greater good of one another? And if we're faithful in those little things, well, then God's going to entrust much to us. You have to read this and you go, would we sacrifice for the salvation of somebody's souls? Would we go through beatings and floggings and shipwrecks and empty stomachs and a dry throat so that people could come to know Jesus? See, please understand something in history. When a group of believers surrenders themselves for the love of Jesus, for the unity of the body, for the salvation of souls, then during those rare, unexplainable windows in history, lives are altered in waves. See, remarkable influence comes together when believers say, God, I love you. I put my preferences aside for the greater good of the whole. I will sacrifice so that others come to know you. And during those rare times in history where churches go, why not us? God does remarkable things. But it's a big thing to get over our desires. Many times what trumps our love for God is love for self. What trumps our love for one another is, I don't want to give up this preference. I like this over here. And I'd like to get rid of you rather than this preference. I don't want to sacrifice so that somebody come to know Jesus. I want people to sacrifice for my comforts. And then the church just kind of loafs along. But in those rare moments in history where believers go, you know what, it's not about me. I love Jesus. I'm willing to die to my own preferences for the greater good of the whole, and I'm willing to sacrifice so that somebody would be able to see what Christ did on the cross. Then during some of those windows of time, God just unleashes his power, and lives are changed in dramatic ways. The staff this fall, we went to a conference in Dallas, and the theme of the conference was, why not us? And so I've just kind of kept that, why not us? Why not our church see phenomenal things that God could do that we don't even think about, we're not even willing to ask him for it? Why not us? And the application becomes, will you lay your preferences down so Jesus wins? Will you sacrifice so that Jesus wins? And then the question becomes, well, okay, but why would I do that? Why in the world would I sacrifice for somebody else's greater good? This past week, Julie and I, we left on Monday afternoon and we came back yesterday. We drove down to Texas and spent time with two of our kids and their spouses and their kids, our 5 grandkids. You know, it was one of those things, it's like this was the block of time in the fall that we could reserve that time to go down and invest in our grandkids and spend some time with them. Had to do it. Came back yesterday from a little town in Texas, 14-hour drive. Julie drove some, I drove some. We still like each other after those 14 hours. You get in the car, you could still smell my breath probably from 14 hours of just, ugh. During that time, I had some time to think and thinking about this message and thinking about our culture. You know, we're seeing an inordinate number of Christian leaders that are falling away from the faith, but then they continue to have this following, and they're teaching them nothing but gobbledygook, just humanistic stuff, saying, hey, whatever you want to believe it, and we'll just, as long as I make money. And it's just so empty. And I asked my daughter, who is 34 years old, she's incredibly wise, and she's got a ministry to young women in her town. And I asked her the question, I said, Whitney, what do you think, why do you think that people fall away from the faith? Why do you think people go, you know what, this Jesus thing, yeah, I once bought into it, no longer, and they walk away? Why? Well, I didn't prepare for the question. And the first answer out of, I don't know, but, and this is what she said that was really profound to me. She said, I think people in their brokenness, they feel so broken. And rather than take their brokenness into church, they feel like if I take my brokenness, the establishment of the church is going to reject me. So they walk away. I thought that makes sense. Because somehow churches kind of set up this aura that once you get your life together, then come and join us because we're all Mary Poppins. We're practically perfect in every way. And we put on the mask and demonstrate, oh yeah, we got it all together. I thought, people in their brokenness, why would they come in here? Because it's like, oh, I'm broken and the establishment is going to shame me. How horrible. This ought to be the safest place for people who are broken because about it. He changes us from the inside. How refreshing. I don't have to be perfect. No, we're not. You can't be. Can you imagine being afraid of, you get really sick and I'm afraid to go to the hospital because if I go to the hospital with my appendicitis, they're going to scold me and laugh at me. And so I can't take my sickness into the hospital because they're going to make fun of me. Can you imagine? I mean, that's ludicrous. And yet the church it's a spiritual hospital where all of us come with all our infirmity. All our disease, this cancer called sin. And Jesus is the only one who can destroy it, annihilate it. So it ought to be the safest place that folks can come in the midst of all their disease. So what happens is the broken people go, I can't go to the church. So what they do is the false teachers of the world prey on them and give them this, what I call this empty religion of tolerance, and they are led astray. They're led astray from Jesus to a convictionless permission of, hey, just live the way you want to live, and it's all okay. Wow. And so today, more than any other time, as the church, we must show what Jesus looks like and the message he came to deliver, now more than ever. That he's the only one that can set the captive free. Or people will be taken captive by a feel-good, and I want to highlight this word, temporary pain relief. You don't need a temporary pain relief. You need an eternal solution. Lord God, I pray, I don't know any other way to say it. Would you help us die to ourselves? Would you help us love you more than we love ourselves? Would you help us love one another by laying our preferences aside for each other's greater good? And would you help us show the world that doesn't know you what you're like? That you died on the cross for our sins and that this disease of sin is eternal, and yet you're the eternal solution. Lord, would you help us in that? Help us die to ourselves, love one another, love the lost. Lord, I pray that no one in this room would be taken captive by bad thinking, but they would come back to the pure, simple devotion that it's Jesus plus nothing, that you are our sufficiency. Lord, if you are sufficient for the Apostle Paul in all the stuff he endured, then Lord, you're sufficient for me and my problems, in my condition, in my situations. You are our sufficiency. We rest in you and you alone. What a privilege to talk with you and to walk with you. And now, God, what we want to do is we want to worship you in song together. Chances are none of us are on the same page in the perfect form of music, but it's not about that. It's about all of us together dying to ourselves and worshiping you. You are the great God who is. We shine a flashlight on you. We want the world to know who you are, not who we are. May we build our resumes based upon all our weaknesses. May that be the way we boast, that in all our weaknesses, you are sufficient. Lord, I don't know everybody's story, but if there's someone here, Holy Spirit, you may be nudging on their heart. Maybe they've kept you at a distance, and they've been trying to do life on their own. That they would simply acknowledge the fact that, Jesus, you died on the cross for their sins. You paid the penalty so they would not have to, and they would submit to you and say, Jesus, thank you that you died on the cross for my sins. I place my belief, my trust in you and you alone for my salvation. Will you forgive me of my sins, past, present, and future? Will you help me walk with you? We have come together because we need you, we need one another, and Lord, we don't have the answers. We are not sufficient of ourselves to claim anything is coming from us, for our sufficiency comes from you. And now we want to worship you in truth, not only in song, but also with our gifts. And all God's people said, amen.